with the fruits of that research. The research led to the successful exhibition Tracking the Dragon in 2010 and the associated catalogue, which is on sale in the foyer, and every penny helps the museum continue this important work, so feel free to buy one. And ultimately the research leading to these 5 essays being launched today. The essays represent groundbreaking research into the role Chinese people played in the development of the Riverina. Their influence went way beyond mining and market gardening and included people who became substantial figures in regional business and our community. There was a very significant contribution to the research from many people from the 5 shires represented in the essays: Hay, Narrandera, Temora, Tumut and Wagga. This generosity is part of the reason the Museum of the Riverina commissioned Barry to write an essay specific to each area, in a sense to return the fruits of all that help and research. These shared regional histories define us beyond local government boundaries. Facilitating projects like this reinforce the importance of the word Riverina in the Museum of the Riverina. Now Dr Barry McGowan is a Canberra-based historian, a heritage consultant and an honorary staff member at the ANU College of Asia and South Pacific, or the Pacific, sorry. He has written extensively on the archaeology and history of the Chinese in Australia and authored these essays. Barry has kindly agreed to attend today to help officially launch them, so please welcome Barry McGowan.
Okay, hold on. It's a bit hard. Let's put it back. Yeah. Thank you for those very kind words, Luke. It's really wonderful to be here and so many people, see so many people and see so many old friends and acquaintances. Now, it's my very great pleasure today to have the task of saying thank you. The Tracking the Dragon project, as Luke has hinted so strongly, is essentially about people. The Chinese people who were so prominent in the region and their descendants, and importantly, to all the people and historical societies that contributed so generously over a period of almost 8 years. Without the stories, the artefacts, the photographs, there would have been no exhibition, and we wouldn't be here today. But first, I'd like to pay tribute to 2 special people, Madeline Scully and Genevieve Mott. Now, Tracking the Dragon was Madeline's brainchild. She is, in my view, a visionary. And the museum and the city of Wagga have been blessed to have her at the helm for so long. Genevieve did the hard yards of curating and editing. Without her work, the exhibition and subsequently this project most certainly would not have happened. Following the success of the exhibition, it became painfully obvious that we'd only touched the tip of the iceberg. It was very frustrating. There were many stories that we had simply been unable to tell for lack of space and lack of time. It was then that Madeline conceived the idea of writing the further set of essays, which will be on the museum's website, I think within the month. In so doing, she unwittingly unleashed a tiger, or should I say, dragon. We were simply overwhelmed. In this regard, I will mention several other people. Geoffrey Chung from Narrandera, Rhonda Sturt and Pam Archer from Tumut, Bob and Betty Menzies from Wagga, Chris Sheehy and Grace Ching. Now, I've emailed and spoken to Chris Sheehy many times, but you know, last night was the first time I had actually met him. How great is that? And Grace Ching, what can I say? She is the encyclopedia chronicler of the Doon family, to whom no detail was too small to record. An extraordinary person. The story of the Riverina, or the Chinese in the Riverina, is one of success, albeit under duress. Nothing came easy. The first Chinese people to arrive in the Riverina came in the early 1850s as indentured labourers and worked on pastoral stations and such work as shepherding. The main wave of Chinese immigration, however, came with the gold rushes. This large-scale immigration was not just based on the lure of gold, but there were important push factors as well. Most of the immigrants came from Guangdong province in southern China, the Delta area, enormously fertile, productive, but with enormous population density, and parts of the Siap district, where most came from, very barren. And to compound these natural pressures were a series of homemade disasters, or man-made I should say, the Taiping Rebellion and its fierce suppression, uprisings by clan and secret society members, and of course the Opium Wars. The discovery of gold saw a population poised and eager to take advantage of these new opportunities. Most entered Australian colonies on the credit ticket system, sponsored by merchants or clan and family members. They were overwhelmingly male, but not always single, many having wives and children back in China. Now, I'll get this right. Hey, so what we have here, that is China, obviously. That's the Guangdong province, the capital of Guangzhou, is the old Canton, Hong Kong, Macau. Compare the size of that with the Riverina. A similar area, but population-wise, there's simply, of course, no comparison. But that is where they came from. They didn't come from up there, anywhere, Shanghai, Beijing. It was simply there. Okay. Most of the Chinese people in the Riverina lived in large self-contained camps in the main towns, with lesser camps in the smaller ones. These were contact zones, a source of labour for European pastorals, a refuge for European women, and a place of entertainment and recreation for others. In the Riverina, the largest camp was at Narrandera, and the second largest at Wagga. In 1883, the Narrandera camp had 340 residents, of whom 303 were Chinese. The village had streets, stores, a temple, Masonic lodge, cook shop, gambling rooms, and later a Christian church. At Wagga, the camp was on the banks of the Narrandera. On either side of Temora Street, it had 223 residents, of whom 194 were Chinese. Deniliquin was the third largest, Hay the fourth largest. In the 1880s, perhaps half of the adult males in the Riverina were Chinese. The Chinese men in the Riverina were a vital source of labour for pastoralists who needed Chinese contractors to engage large groups to ring bark trees and clear their properties of timber. Ring barking was very effective in improving grass growth and could double the number of stock on a property. Throughout the 1880s, newspapers advertised thousands of hectares of ringing and barking, all of which was done by Chinese labour. In the Narrandera area, if a station owner wanted some ringing or scrubbing done, he got in touch with Wang Gui, a Chinese contractor. Gui would inspect the proposed contract and then start haggling for terms. After making a deal, he'd return to Narrandera and interview Sam Yep, a Chinese storekeeper, who supplied the rations and delivered the men to the job. When the men arrived at the property, the tents and bark cooking galley would arise as if by magic, with a palisade built around them. Sometimes, Gui had several jobs going at once, extending into thousands and thousands of hectares. And the Chinese men were engaged in many other tasks as well on the stations: market garden, cooking, fencing, rabbiting, dam construction, wool washing and shearing. Importantly, they were not a servile labour force. In the 1880s, one manager said he was very pleased with the work of the Chinese labourers, but lamented that they refused to work at the prevailing rates and bargained for higher ones. While most of the labourers came from the Riverina camps in the towns, many also came from Victoria, in particular the Chinese camp at Wagga. One of the contractors was Chen R.Q., a Wagga merchant. He sent out gangs of 20 to 40 men as far west as Deniliquin, with enough stores to last them up to 6 months. Chinese labour from Victoria was also used extensively in the Narrandera district. The economic value of Chinese pastoral labour was totally undisputed. It was not so much that their labour was cheaper, for sometimes they earned the same wages or more than the European men. It was because they were steadier and more reliable and found ready to do nearly all the rough work on the stations. One squatter criticised the European labourer, saying that, quote, "They can't do it at the price, and if they take a contract, they do so only to get a draw of rations and then clear out and take the tools with them. It's quite different with the Chinese. We only deal with the head man, and whatever price he accepts, the work is done, always, even when they can't earn tucker at it, and then they don't get drunk and kick up rows." Market gardens. The value of the Chinese men in market gardens was equally appreciated. At the Nilluquin, a favourable climate, adequate water, meant that 3 crops could be harvested each year. At Hay, in 1867, the correspondent referred to the Chinese practice of taking all the town refuse and converting it into cabbage, and the meticulous way they looked after their plants, ridding them of aphids by brushing them individually with soap suds. He stated, "No whites that do this, they don't have the patience." At Wagga, most market gardens were in the lagoon area, known as North Wagga Island, though some were in the Chinese camp in Fitzmaurice Street. At Hay, in 1911, the Chinese gardeners planted a considerable area out to oranges and mandarins, which stated that the trees must have returned the enterprising planters quite a substantial profit, judging by the numbers of people visiting the gardens on holidays and Sundays. Well, because the Chinese market gardens were almost always located near waterways, they were very susceptible to flooding. In 1931, the floods were particularly testing. The Chinese gardens and homes at Gundagai and Narrandera were flooded. While at Wagga, Constable Norrell had his work cut out rescuing Willie Chong, for while persuading Willie to leave, he was bitten on the leg by his dog. So let us have a look at some of this. That's the only photo known in existence of a scrub cutting camp. They were, of course, much larger than that, but you get the general picture of the conditions under which they were working. We haven't quite got onto the tobacco harvesters, but I'll be on that shortly. Chinese men also grew tobacco, particularly in the Tumut area. And that is the famous Dangar Chi there. On the left, 2 Chinese growers and a buyer. Well, that's a Chinese market garden. I think his horse could probably do a few cabbages for the look of it. And that's a rare photo as well, I should say. That's Frangania, a Barango station near Wagga, with a lot of cabbages on his in his truck. Oh, this is the one I was looking for. That is the Chinese camp and the gardens there, and some of the camp there at Narrandera in flood. This is a substantial camp, it's not just a few shacks, is it? And that's the Chinese market garden. They call it the brewery garden. Well, the camp was somewhere else, but that again is a substantial market garden, and of course it's flood time, but yet again. Well, you might think that's pretty lousy accommodation, but within that, if you look closely, that would have been a sapling when that was built. The 6 bunks, 3 either side, a bathtub, reticulated water from the Narrandera River. That was actually substantial accommodation, and not much different or worse or whatever than what shearers would have put up with. Okay. In the mid-1870s, the Chinese began growing tobacco and maize. The main area was, as I've said, Tumut Plains, but Hills Creek and Calcutta as well. They were tenant farmers, renting the land from European landowners, usually at a higher rate than most Europeans. They're financed by Tumut-based entrepreneurs. The main one was Dang Archie, we've just seen a photo of him. He helped set up the farms, insure their crops, and bargain the landowners and buyers, as we have seen. In 1885, the Chinese farmers were in control, or by then, of the hops industry, and 2 years later, tobacco production was entirely in their hands. Quote, "Your white not being possessed of the patience absolutely necessary to the successful production of this well-paying but delicate crop." Well, it doesn't appear as if the Europeans are very patient, does it? Some Chinese men owned their own farms outright, growing wheat and raising sheep. Betty Menzies from Wagga recalled that her grandfather, William Kwon, owned several properties at Grongrong near Narrandera, all with water frontage. Virginia merchant James Wong Chewy owned a large property near Junee, and the Me Ling family from Temora also had substantial property holdings. Storekeepers. Many men were storekeepers. The stores were mostly general in nature and sold both Chinese and European goods. And they were very competitive. The Me Ling store in Temora frequently ran large advertisements. January 1912, they advertised the greatest sale ever held in Temora with sensational reductions in prices. The stores were multifunctional, essential role they played within Chinese Australian society, housing newly arrived countrymen, providing them with board as well as information, assistance and protection, and finding work. The storekeepers also helped in the purchase of travel documents, translation, letter writing, banking and money remittance. Dang Quang Wing store in Tumut was one of these stores. Each weekend, the Chinese men came in from their farms to collect provisions and mail, and often stayed the night. Men stayed at Willie Shahee's store at Tumut before returning to China, and Willie looked after them, helping pay their fares back home if necessary. If they died, he attended to all their affairs and forwarded on their money to the families. Some of the storekeepers were very successful. Dang Ah Chi had 2 large stores in Tumut and Gundagai. In 1900, on the eve of his departure for China, these stores and associated properties and stock were valued at £50,000, an enormous sum of money for those times. James Wong Chewy had branch stores in several towns. As a wool buyer, he built up large trade between Australia in the east, and in 1916 his turnover was a massive £200,000. Further into the 20th century, the Chinese people diversified into many other businesses. Tommy Ah Wah had a garage, service station, boarding house and taxi business in Junee, and between the 30s and 50s owned a garage, the Grand Garage, and a motor vehicle showroom in Wagga. Another Chinese garage owner in Junee was Clary Leslie. He also had a hotel. Dame Charles Dean from Tumut was also a storekeeper. The family later operated a dry cleaning service, a trucking company which carted timber for the local mills and for large projects such as the Snowy Mountain scheme. They also owned a very successful horse syndicate, horses from their stables winning many races in the Riverina, and one, of course, R1 winning the Melbourne Cup in 1978. The Choi family played a very significant role in the commercial life of Grongrong. Bert Choi was the first barber, owned the pool hall, next to which was Reliance Garage, owned by Harry and Percy Choi. Harry also ran a garage with his son Bill, which later became an engineering and fabrication business, steel fabrication. Albert Choi ran a garage in Griffith, later shifting to Narrandera, where he opened a dry cleaning business which is still operating today. Just some of these stores. These are very substantial, aren't they? They're not just fly-by-night affairs, very substantial. Okay. The Chinese migrants were very successful in maintaining their traditions and beliefs. The native place associations were formed by men from the same district or county of origin, and Australia were primarily benevolent institutions, promoting mutual interest among members and protecting the interests of new immigrants and offering a meeting place. James Wong Chewy was a strong patron of the SEAP Society, and his stores would have served as de facto district association premises. Other merchants did the same. The secret societies were based on sworn brotherhood and could include men from different districts or counties. In Australia, the best known was the Hung Men, and in the gold rush years, probably about half the Chinese population were members. The evidence for the Hung Men in the Riverina is simply overwhelming. In Narrandera, a subscription board has recently been located after having served time as a bookshelf. It's now in the museum there. The most visible signs of Chinese traditional life are the New Year's Eve festivals and the Mid-Autumn Festival, the focal points of which were the temple. Chinese New Year was celebrated very openly, and although the noise from the fireworks was often complained about, attracted very large crowds of onlookers, European onlookers. The lanterns, coloured paper, incense, noise, aroma of cooked food added an exotic touch to the otherwise staid surrounds of these towns. In Wagga in 1869, there was much slaughter of pigs and poultry, banging of crackers, drinking of grog and other sports. Large numbers of Chinese men had come in from the country and made a night of it with their friends. The opening of new temples was also accompanied with much ceremony. In 1887, over 200 Chinese men came from all parts of the colony to Wagga to commemorate the opening of the new temple. A great many townspeople also visited the temple during the first 3 days, the correspondent experiencing the genuine hospitality of a leading storekeeper. Lodge functions were generally much more secretive, but in Hay, at the opening of a lodge in 1903, many European observers were invited. Another major Chinese festival which is celebrated openly was the Qing Min or Qing Min, held twice a year to honour the deceased. It involved a graveside ceremony with a festival or commemorative function afterwards. Chinese cemeteries were another visible sign of traditional life. The largest cemeteries were located in the boundaries of the European cemeteries and had burning towers and offertory tables, as is the case at Wagga. The importance of traditional Chinese burial customs such as feng shui and exhumation is very evident at some cemeteries. Exhumations were elaborate and painstaking undertakings, and there was much ceremony associated with them. The first account in the Riverina was in 1882 when Deng Chi received permission to remove the remains of his countrymen from several burial grounds. I'll just look for a few others slides here. The laundry in Narrandera, and an advertisement for the Dune Trucking Company. That is a rather forlorn temple in Albury in the 1930s. The only photo we've got actually of a temple in the Riverina. And that's a Chinese cemetery at Hay in a rather poor state of repair. Okay. Many Chinese men became Christian converts. Belonging to a Christian church was seen as one way of bridging the racial divide, and was also inevitable where Chinese men had married European women. An added attraction was the prospect of attending English classes. In the 1890s, a number of Chinese churches were established in the larger Riverina towns, where separate Chinese churches did not exist. The converts attended the local church of their choice. Where the deceased Chinese were Christian converts, Christian and sometimes Chinese rites were usually performed. Some Europeans viewing this blending of rites with disdain and referred to them as heathen customs. With the gradual decline of the Chinese population, the camps and traditional places of worship and burial fell into neglect. First to go were the temples, along with the rest of the camp buildings. In the early 1980s, Wendy Hucker, a Wagga resident, wrote to the council pointing out the parlous state of the Chinese cemetery. Only a few graves had their headstones intact, and the burning tower and offertory table needed repair. Fortunately, the cemetery was redeveloped, as you can see today, and the tower and offertory tables restored. Prejudice and discrimination. Much of the prejudice and discrimination against the Chinese people rose from popular perceptions that the camps were dens of iniquity. These perceptions can be sheeted home to the fact that the Chinese camps were predominantly male domains, which meant that the men's social lives were pursued largely outside the family environment, while partners sought from the local non-Chinese population, many of whom were regarded as women of ill repute. In 1884, Sub-Inspector Brennan remarked that some of those women had married Chinese men and appeared respectable and kept aloof altogether from the bad characters. Their homes too were clean and comfortable, and the Chinese, and presumably their wives as well, showed great interest in their children's education. Of the less respectable wives, he was scathing, claiming that they made the lives of their unfortunate Chinese husbands miserable. When not at war with their husbands, they fight with one another, seek redress in the police courts, and the Chinese husbands have to pay the fine. He said that the prostitutes and most of the disreputable married women were the principal cause of all the disturbances, robberies and crimes in the camps. In 1888, the Narrandera correspondent witnessed a dispute late at night between Riverina and Mrs. Smith, describing the camps a perfect inferno and claiming that the language must have ruffled the placid waters of the Murrumbidgee River as well as the fishes beneath. Well, women such as Lizzie Fee, however, were probably the exception rather than the rule. But the aspirant middle class in the Riverina and the local press would have none of this. These were bad women and they were castigated for that. And with the women's reputation went the reputation of the Chinese men and the camps. The Chinese men were also criticised for gambling and opium smoking. At Wagga, concerns about gambling began to emerge in the early 1880s. An observer commented that the lottery appeared to be carried out honestly enough. But that when the game attracted children of tender years, it was time for the law to step in and stay any further proceedings of that kind. Opium smoking was commonplace in the camps, and to a large degree substituted for the drinking of alcohol, which was largely the preserve of Europeans. Some local observers were sympathetic to the plight of the Chinese opium users and gamblers. One observer commented that the effects of excessive opium use were far less than alcohol, and noted that fan tan was only played by those who could afford to play. Oh, okay.
Sorry to interrupt,
Okay,
ladies.
just checking, make
But
sure
I think
it's
it's,
switched on.
but it's so worth hearing, isn't it, Tom?
You think that's okay?
Yes,
Yeah,
is that on?
all right.
Sorry.
Okay, well, Chinese men were rarely ever drunk and rarely prosecuted for such, and that was commonly recognised. The evidence for prejudice and discrimination in the legal system is mixed. The Chinese men made full use of the courts to prosecute individuals, including their own men, countrymen, and were generally treated in an even-handed way. By contrast, the application of the law by the police appeared to be very heavily weighted against the Chinese men, who were seen as an easy target. The prosecutions for gambling are a good instance of this. A local correspondent saying in Wagga in 1888 that it was well known that gambling was carried out every night at some clubs and hotels, but that many people, including the police, were aware of it. But it was the Chinese men who were singled out. With slide grog selling, it is doubtful if the police would have had anywhere near as much success in making arrests and securing convictions without willing informants who were rewarded for their dubious acts with half the fine. One of the most common offences committed against the Chinese was fruit and vegetable stealing, which amongst local youths almost reached the state of a rite of passage. The other common offence was, of course, assault, almost always unprovoked, and usually committed by the larrikin element, who were castigated by the courts and the press. At Wagga in January 1881, the correspondent remarked that assaults upon the Chinese by larrikins were very common, notwithstanding the severe sentences and fines. And an Adelaide in the same year was stated that the Celestials had much to complain about. It was almost impossible for them to move without being assaulted. Overall, the level of physical provocation and abuse in the Riverina, bad as it was, never rose to anything seen on the goldfields on occasions or in the Americas. But there were some instances of mass assault. Well, the most notorious was the Battle of Hillston Bridge in 1895, in which one Chinese man was killed and two severely injured. The fracas occurring on Chinese New Year and involving about 30 Chinese men and 20 Europeans, some of whom were inebriated and had abused the hospitality of the Chinese men. The perpetrators were brought to trial with lack of reliable witnesses, as usual, and no one was convicted of manslaughter. Many instances of abuse never made it into the courts, especially when the targets were children. The legendary jockey Ted Doone, a descendant of Dame Charles Doone of Tumut, recalled that while walking to the Anglican church on Sunday, he and his brothers were sometimes accosted by young boys and horses, who chased the terrified boys all the way to church. Their father retaliated by buying each of the boys a pair of boxing gloves and a punching bag. The next time they were ready, and their assailants got a good belting.
Not quite sure.
The some experience, I think I've come unhooked or something again.
Sorry. Technology, it's wonderful when it works. For some reason, that is switched itself off for us, but I think every word's worth hearing.
Oh, okay, well, for some, the experience was much worse. Members of a Wagga-based family recalled that while the boys were taunted at school, they could hold their own. They could fight their way out of it, in other words. Not so the girls, particularly if they had darker skin. They were teased and bullied, called chinks and half-castes. A girl from another Wagga family committing suicide as a result. Colonial immigration restrictions. While the late 1870s anti-Chinese sentiments were escalating as a result of increased Chinese immigration and a decision by one of the steamship companies to replace Australian crews by Chinese crews at half the going rate. And there was a big strike in Queensland in the latter part of 1878 as a consequence. Restrictive immigration legislation was introduced by the Victorian New South Wales governments in 1881. The restrictions stemmed the tide to some extent, but before long, anti-Chinese sentiments rose again. The social and moral arguments put forward in favour of restricting Chinese immigration were racist, totally, and reflected a basic resentment and also dislike of having to mix with a culturally different people. Journals such as the Bulletin were critical of encouraging these sentiments, and some local writers came close to the Bulletin's tirades. Most, however, were a little more ambivalent.
Do you mind?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's fine. No, I'm
sorry.
Out of extras. Trying to solve the paper before. Sometimes expressing a disapproval of the Chinese as a race, but conceding their economic value and insisting on their rights to protection as residents of the colony. In the Riverina, town and country life allowed for a greater familiarity of one race with the other than in the metropolitan cities. Many white Australians knew or were acquaintances of Chinese peoples, gardeners, labourers, storekeepers, and familiar with their rights, festivals and customs. Anti-Chinese sentiments did occasionally, however, result in protest meetings, and in December 1887 an anti-Chinese league was formed at Tumut, and a circular sent to European landowners requesting them not to renew leases to the Chinese or let fresh land to them. However, the league's effectiveness was blunted by the unwillingness of many landowners to embrace its central proposition, as they regard the Chinese farmers, and the tobacco farmers of course, as their bread and butter. The debate on and passage of the 1888 immigration restrictions reflected a deep-seated fear of a resurgent China and racial xenophobia, sentiments fomented by the Premier, Sir Henry Parkes, who believed in an imminent Asian invasion. Earlier, the Riverina press had welcomed the imposition of restrictive measures, but Parkes' hysterical outbursts and unconstitutional actions and his harsh and hurried legislation proved too much for his supporters. The Riverina press now pleaded the case for British justice and criticised the extreme measures in the legislation. The most objectionable provisions were removed, but the remaining ones were harsh, the poll tax being increased to prohibited £100. Chinese migration was all but prohibited, other than by people smuggling. Several court reports indicate quite clear sympathy with the long-time Chinese residents who were caught by what seemed to be an uncaring bureaucracy, the White Australia policy. This policy had its basis in these earlier restrictions, a continuing fear of the alien other and perceptions of unfair economic competition. Again, the underlying motivation was a deep-seated racism and the need and the desire to promote the ideal of racial homogeneity. The new arrangements became effective in October 1902. Any Chinese person wishing to leave Australia could apply for a certificate of domicile. They were replaced by a dictation test in 1905, which was made available to residents of good character who had lived in Australia for 5 years. But the bureaucratic needs for administering these were complex and involved photographs, handprints and character references. The Chinese people may have been residents of Australia, but they were not free people, and aware that any slip-up on their part could mean that their applications could be refused. Despite the tight policing and enforcement of these restrictions, evasion and other illegal methods were used.
Members of the Chinese community supported court cases and other legal challenges, and the authorities were a little bit wary of taking the case to court if they thought they'd get an adverse decision. For instance, a few Chinese brides adopted the name and Australian birth certificates of Chinese children who'd been born in Australia, but had returned to China while still young and died. Women who came with these false identities had to maintain them for the rest of their lives. Charles' Dean's wife, Esther, was certainly one of these women. They were married in China, but she had to stay there. She could not come to Australia. She adopted the name of Esther Gao, a member of the Gao family from Mandalay. The family had gone to China in 1894, and one of the children, Esther, had either died there or decided not to return to Australia. But his frustrations didn't stop there with the arrival of Esther, for the family was under constant surveillance. Charles' attitude to the visits from the authorities was that, quote, there had to be a new face at the table every year. Esther's pregnancies ensuring that she could not be deported. But their son Richard was still in China, and the whole family was not reunited until 1952. The He family also faced challenges. Willie Shea Fee married Chin Si in China, but then had to return to Australia, leaving Chin Si in his home village where his first son Ted was born. In 1927, Chin Si and Ted came to Australia on temporary visas and lived at Tumut for 6 years, where more children were born. In 1933, the family, with the exception of Ted, returned to China. Once again, Willie had to return. Another son, Joe, was born, and the family then had to flee China because of the Japanese occupation. Continuing concerns about the possible deportation of Chin Si, Joe and Ted led Willie to approach Rose Chewy, the wife of James Wong Chewy. She approached a neighbour who then approached local federal member, Professor Bland, to ask that the Chin Si, Ted and Joe be granted permanent exemption to live in Australia. The neighbour wrote also to the Minister for Immigration, Harold Holt. Well, surprise, surprise, Harold Holt actually agreed. This is the letter that Bland wrote. He said it was a pity that there were not more people with the reasonableness of Harold Holt. You've got to remember, however, that this white Australia country looks askance at every foreigner. I've been arguing that the world is full enough of hardship and misery without our deliberately adding to the volume of refusing families the joy of reunion when all their world had been destroyed by circumstances over which they had no control. Well, that possibly could apply here in Australia today, couldn't it? Notwithstanding these prejudices, discrimination, the exceptional generosity of the Chinese people was often commented upon. The New Year's celebration is a good example. But while white Australians were largely observers, occasionally they were invited to the feasts. And there are many examples of that. They were exceptionally generous towards local charities such as the hospitals. And the Riverina Grazier carried regular lists of contributors to the Hay Hospital, Europeans and Chinese alike. In 1879, the list contained the names of 52 Chinese registered visitors to Hay, the names of 30 Chinese at the small town of Bullable, plus contributions from those on the stations. The Chinese also took part in local concerts, fetes and processions, particularly where fundraising was involved, and were ready contributors to other worthy causes. In 1894, a number of Chinese people took part in the Hillston Hospital fete procession and participated in the Chinese Games, races of the Games that followed. There were many instances of affection at the departure of a long-term Chinese resident for China or at his funeral. One such instance of the former occurred at Journey in 1903 when Tommy Arnett entertained 60 of his friends in the church at a banquet prior to his departure for China. The Reverend Bound said that he was a good citizen and a loyal subject, and in fact was the most exemplary man in every sense of the word. And Adlong in 1888, the funeral cortege of Arnhem storekeeper, was one of the largest witnessed for some time, there being no less than 600 at the graveside. And the Reverend Sauls, referring to the honest manliness of his character, he was always ready to assist charities and other religious denominations. Now, emboldened by an intricate system of intermarriage, clan and family allegiances and networks, many Chinese men went on to create miniature dynasties in Australia and become highly respected within their local district. Dang Ah Chi was a highly respected and generous Tumut businessman and together with his brother Dang Bowen Slooey and their relatives formed a business dynasty that lasted many years. Dang Charles Doon was also a relative. On his death in 1955, it was said his motto was fair and square to all and honest dealing. No one had an adverse word to say against him. He'd been one of the first Chinese people to be baptised in the Tumut Church of England, a member of the first Chinese Sunday school at Tumut Plains, and the founder of the JA Boys organisation in Tumut. Bob Doon passed away in 2007. He was described as popular with people from all walks of life, a man well known and well respected in the community. Together with his wife May, Bob had contributed enormously to the local community. Through his involvement with the Tumut Lions Club and in recognition for her charitable work, May was awarded Tumut Citizen of the Year in 1991. In 2004, she was awarded the Order of Australia Medal. Another strong family network was that involving Sam Yet and his nephew George Hock Shung and the R. King family from Riverina. George succeeded Sam Yet in his business, married Jessie Lamont, the daughter of Adelaide Lamont and Willie R. King. On his death, George, obituary writer, stated that he was respected by all who knew him. He had many good qualities and in past years had been a contributor to the hospital and other movements. His son Hilton was very popular and highly respected, and together with his brother Keith, was regarded as one of the best greyhound judges in New South Wales. Another family connection straddling the length and breadth of the Rima involved the Pack and Choi families. Alex spent most of his time working as a shearer. A brother Harold, enlisted in the army in the Second World War, was taken prisoner in Libya, and he turned in Italy, but escaped from the camp, wandered around North Italy, ended up in Switzerland, and then later Australia. Back in Australia, he became a member of the Hayes Services Club and did a lot of charitable work in an unobtrusive manner. One of Alex's sisters, Florence, married Harry Choi from Grong Grong. They had two children, Bill and Betty. Betty is here today with her husband, Bob. The Choi family was very highly regarded in Grong Grong and Narrandera. On his death in 1949, Albert Choi's obituary writer stated that he interested himself with the progress of the township and was held in high esteem by all who knew him. His wife, Rita, had passed away the previous year. In her obituary, she was described as a highly respected resident of the Narrandera district. James Wong Chewy was one of the most influential and wealthy Chinese men in the Riverina. His range of contacts was immense at every level. He was a confidant of the then Premier of New South Wales, William Holman, and in October 1916 called upon his services to help rescue his adopted son, who'd been kidnapped by bandits in China. Well, they got him back, but they had to pay money for it, a ransom in other words. His wife, Rose, passed away in 1953. It was said of her that she was fondly remembered for her lovable disposition, benevolence, charitable and Christian principles. Another prominent Junee identity was Tommy Wah. Russell Danswan worked for the Wahs almost his entire working life and remembers them as very kind and considerate employees. George Mei Ling Sr. and his wife Chen were residents of Temora from the earliest days. On his departure for China in 1910 with his family, the members of the Masonic Lodge presented George with an illustrated testimonial as a small token of their deep appreciation of your efforts in always promoting the best interests and harmony of the Lodge. The experiences of the Nye family also illustrate the strength of family and kinship networks. Ted Nye from Wagga joined the army in 1941 and saw active service in the Burma campaign in Papua New Guinea. He was, for bravery, mentioned in dispatches. Another story of military commitment comes from the family of William Flood Sam, a Wagga resident for 18 years at one stage, and subsequently a resident in the West Wyalong area. Two of his sons, James and Norman, saw action at Gallipoli. Three other sons also enlisted, as did two grandsons, William and George Lulong. William won a military medal in Bar, and George Flood Sam a military medal, a substantial contribution and commitment to the Australian community by any measure. The most amazing war story probably concerns the Albury-based Poy family. During World War II, three of Louisa McCoy's sons, William, Roy and Lindsay, were in different parts of Asia fighting the Japanese. William joined the British Army in Hong Kong, won the military medal. The city was captured, and he was captured, later escaped, and by some miracle managed to get his whole family on an exchange ship, diplomatic exchange ship to Canada, where that family now lives. One of his sons, William, William became a very successful businessman, and in 1999, his daughter, Adrienne, became the first person of Asian descent to be appointed Governor General of Canada. So the fame of the Chinese Australians is international in one sense. Another one of the brothers wasn't so fortunate. Roy was captured to fall of Singapore, ended up in Changi Jail, and ended up on the notorious Thai-Burma railway. He did not have very pleasant memories of that. Occasionally, several strong and genuine relationships were formed between Chinese people and white Australians. Perhaps the best known, and my last example here, is that of a North Wagga-based market gardener, Charlie Wong Hing. One of Charlie's customers was Eric Roberts, who was trying to establish a radio station in Wagga. By the early 1930s, he had very little money left after expenses, and Charlie often did not charge him for his vegetables. When Charlie's horse died, Eric bought him another one, and in the Second World War obtained Charlie a job as a market gardener in the Air Force, I think at Uraquinti. After the war, Eric employed Charlie as a gardener, cook and general help on his farm at Clear Springs. Eric's adopted daughter, the late Wendy Hucker, stated, "Whatever Charlie wanted, he got." Now, to conclude, what I've given is a very brief overview of the Chinese experience in the Riverina, their issues that they had, prejudice, discrimination, their successes as storekeepers, and of course the problems that they had with the immigration restrictions. That so many wonderful and moving stories have come to the fore is a tribute to you all, for this is very much your history. Notwithstanding all the prejudice and discrimination, the Chinese people were integral to the economic and social development of the Riverina. And daily aspects of their lives, such as the festivals and burial ceremonies, were an ever-present reality. These people were not sojourners, but true Australians and pioneers. As land clearers, miners and gardeners, they changed the landscape and the economy and enhanced considerably the quality of life for many Australians. Their generosity to all manner of charities and worthy causes, and their participation in a myriad of social and sporting organisations substantially enriched the social and community life of many towns and villages. Up until now, this story has been largely a lost history. It is hoped that the study will help redress some of this neglect and place the Riverina story to the forefront where it belongs. For it is mainstream, spanning, in some instances, 4 generations to the present day. The Riverina Shire councils are now well placed to capitalise on a rising interest by the Chinese people in their Australian heritage, and there may well be opportunities to broaden this interest by perhaps embracing a wider regional approach. Hopefully, this study will also suggest further new directions for research, not only in the Riverina, but elsewhere. I want to thank you all very much again for being here today. Thank you.
I beg your pardon. Thank you very much, Dr. Barry McGowan. Now, I've been told we have in the audience, and I know Barry referred to one, representatives from the local government areas who these essays are based upon. So Pam Archer from Tumut and Roy Wade from Narrandera. We're just wondering if either of you would like to come forward and Barry can present you with a copy of the essay relating to your area. So Pam and Roy, if you'd like to come up, and Barry can present.
I think this is Pam. Yes. Good. Pleasure to meet you and see you here tonight. Well, you've got me with glasses. Well, thank you. Yes, I should add the roadshow continues.
Can you stay there for a moment, if you don't mind?
Would you mind?
Dr McGowan, do you mind coming forward?
Yeah, sure.
And we'll just get a photo of the two of you. Thank you very much.
Pam mentioned the word orange. What that means is that, yes, there is another project on the way at the moment
Thank you very
between
much.
myself and Genevieve and in the Orange Central West District in New South Wales.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim. And Roy, if you would like to come forward, and that's the Narrandera essay.
Okay, right. Right. Thank you, very much. Pleasure to see you here today. Fantastic. Oh, that's okay. Well, you mentioned him too. I had a few good words to say to him. I'm sure he'll be happy with that.
Thank you for that.
Oh, thank you for all the work done by the museum, the college museum there, and the people in it. It was a fantastic contribution from Narrandera.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our session this morning. Feel free to partake of refreshments and stop for a chat, have a look at the exhibition that's on, or catch up with Barry. Thank you for coming.
Whatever that is.
When you look at the dog, I with fellas, it was Carol, but they were all frogs and how they were, sent out and whatever. It adds to the story about the women that were in dire circumstances, but they weren't. Well, we don't know.
Anyway, he worked it out just to be too long.
But I mean, she'd been working there for like 14 months.
Yeah, but Gary's pushed right on. It was over 3,000 very quickly.
By the time she was 16,
It's interesting. We were coming back.
definitely the Canadian thing.
Hill coming up towards us. There was two cyclists coming. I said, I've never seen cyclists. When you hear that, you know, his concluding remarks there, they're coming back on that with the boys. No wonder when you open your mouth, you killed them that day. And that woman went,